Welcome, dear travelers of the night. I'm here with you in this quiet hour, when the world settles into its gentle rhythm and our minds open to the stories that have shaped humanity for thousands of years. You've found your way to mystic bedtime. Stories, a sanctuary where ancient wisdom meets peaceful rest, where the echoes of distant civilizations can soothe your soul as you drift toward sleep. Tonight, we journey together to a land where every stone tells a story, where every hill holds memories of kings and shepherds, prophets and dreamers. We're traveling to the ancient crossroads of the world, to a place where three continents meet, and where the very air seems to shimmer with the weight of history and the lightness of hope. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest softly on the gentle darkness around you. Feel yourself settling deeper into comfort, your breathing becoming slower and more peaceful. The day's concerns are fading now, replaced by the timeless cadence of a story that began 4,000 years ago and continues to whisper its truths to us even now. Picture, if you will, the golden light of sunset falling across rolling hills covered in olive trees. The air carries the scent of wild herbs and warm stone, while somewhere in the distance, a shepherd's flute plays a melody that seems older than memory itself. This is the land of Canaan, the crossroads where Asia meets Africa, where the desert meets the sea, and where heaven, it was believed, met earth in the most profound way imaginable. Here, in this ancient landscape, we find ourselves drawn to one city above all others, a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt, conquered and liberated, mourned and celebrated more than perhaps any other place on earth. The city has worn many names like precious jewels: Zion, the city of David, the holy city, the city of peace. But tonight, we know it simply as Jerusalem. And in the gentle darkness of this evening hour, we can almost hear its ancient walls whispering their secrets to the wind. Our story tonight is not one of battles and conquests, though there were many. It is not a tale of politics and power, though these two played their part. Instead, this is a story about faith and doubt, about promises made and promises kept, about a people's journey from slavery to freedom, from wandering to belonging, from despair to hope that would not die. As we begin this gentle journey through time, let your mind wander like a warm breeze across the Mediterranean, carrying with it the voices of those who walked these paths before us. Abraham, the wanderer who believed in promises that seemed impossible. Moses, who led his people through the wilderness toward a dream of home. David, the shepherd boy who became a king and chose a small hilltop city to be the center of his world. Solomon, who built a temple so beautiful that visitors came from the ends of the earth just to witness its glory. These are not just historical figures frozen in time, but real people who felt joy and sorrow, who made difficult choices, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed, who loved and lost and hoped and dreamed, just as we do. Their stories have been told around countless fires, in countless homes, in countless languages for thousands of years. And tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of your own space, their voices join ours in this ancient tradition of sharing stories. In the darkness, the moonlight that falls on your window tonight, trusting in a promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars above. It is the same silver light that guided Moses and his people through 40 years in the wilderness, always moving toward a homeland they could only imagine. It is the light that fell on young David as he tended his father's sheep in the hills. Outside Bethlehem, dreaming perhaps of adventures he could never have imagined would come to pass. Tonight, as you rest here in the comfort of your own home, you are part of this continuing story. You are connected to these ancient voices, not just by the stories themselves, but by the very human experiences they represent. The search for meaning, the longing for home, the need to believe in something greater than ourselves, the hope that our lives have purpose and that our struggles lead somewhere beautiful. So let us begin our journey together, dear friend. Let us walk the ancient paths with soft footsteps and open hearts. Let us listen to the whispers of old Jerusalem, where every stone was laid with prayer, every gate opened onto mystery, and every sunset painted the sky with the colors of divine promise. The night is deep and peaceful around us, and our story is about to unfold like a scroll written in starlight, telling us of a time when the distance between earth and heaven seemed no greater than the space between one heartbeat and the next. Welcome to the ancient kingdom of Israel, where our gentle journey begins in the tent of a nomad named Abraham, dreaming under the vast canopy of the desert sky. Let us travel back now, far back through the corridors of time, to a world where cities were few and the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions. It is nearly 4,000 years ago, and in the ancient city of Ur, nestled between the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates, lives a man whose name will echo through eternity. His name is Abram, though he does not yet know that this name too will change. Just as everything else in his life is about to transform in ways he cannot imagine. Ur is a magnificent city for its time, with towering ziggurats reaching toward the heavens and bustling markets filled with the treasures of distant lands. The people worship many gods here, gods of the moon and stars, gods of the rivers and the harvest. But Abram feels something stirring within him, a quiet dissatisfaction with the bronze and clay idols that fill his father's shop. There is something else calling to him, something that seems to speak not from outside, but from within, not from the crowded temples, but from the vast silence of the desert night. Imagine him now, this man who would become the father of nations, standing outside his tent in the cool evening air. He is 75 years old, an age when most men have long settled into the rhythms of their final years. His hair is silver, his hands weathered by decades of work, and his heart carries the particular sadness of a man whose greatest dream has never come to pass. For Abram and his beloved wife Sarai are childless, and in their culture, in their time, this is not merely a personal sorrow, but a kind of spiritual death, for who will carry on their memory when they are gone? But on this particular evening, as Abram stands beneath the endless canopy of stars, something extraordinary happens. The voice that he has been hearing in his heart becomes clear, unmistakable, filled with a power that makes the earth beneath his feet seem to tremble with possibility. The voice speaks to him as clearly as I am speaking to you now, dear listener. In the quiet of your own evening hour, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, the voice says, and though it is gentle, it carries the weight of absolute authority. Go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Can you imagine the moment, dear friend? Can you feel the enormity of what is being asked? Here is a man being called to leave everything familiar, everything safe, everything he has built over 7 decades of life. He is being asked to walk away from his father's house, from the gods of his ancestors, from the city where he knows every street and every face. He is being asked to become a wanderer with no destination except faith itself. And yet, as Abram stands there in the desert night, feeling the cool wind on his face and hearing his own heart beating in the silence, he knows with a certainty that surprises him that he will say yes. Not because the journey will be easy, not because he can see the destination, but because for the first time in his life, he feels truly called to something greater than himself. The preparations for departure are both simple and profound. There are no moving trucks in this ancient world, no storage units or forwarding addresses. Everything that matters must be carried or led or trusted to memory. Sarai packs their few precious possessions, the household goods that have served them well, the small treasures that connect them to their past, the practical items they will need for life on the road. Abram gathers his servants and his flocks, the sheep and goats and cattle that represent their wealth and their security, but most importantly, they carry with them something invisible and invaluable, a promise that seems impossible from every practical standpoint, but that fills their hearts with a strange, quiet joy. They are leaving behind the familiar gods of yore, gods you can see and touch and understand, in favor of a God who seems to exist in the spaces between words, in the silence between thoughts, in the vast mystery of existence itself. The journey begins at dawn, and as their small caravan moves slowly away from the walls of Yore, Abram does something that will become characteristic of him throughout his long life. He does not look back, not once. Instead, he keeps his eyes fixed on the horizon, trusting that each step forward is a step toward the fulfillment of a promise that he cannot yet comprehend, but that he believes with every fiber of his being. They travel northwest, following ancient trade routes that have carried merchants and pilgrims for centuries. The landscape changes gradually around them. The fertile river valleys give way to rolling hills, the hills to desert, the desert to mountains. Through it all, Abram and Sarai maintain their faith, not because the journey is easy, but because they have learned to hear the voice of the divine in the wind that cools them during the day and in the stars that guide them at night. Along the way, they pause in Haran, a city that sits like a jewel on the great caravan route between east and west. Here they stay for several years, long enough for Abram's father to live out his final days in comfort, long enough for their flocks to multiply and their wealth to grow. But always, in the back of Abram's mind, is the knowledge that Haran is not their destination. They are travelers still, pilgrims on a journey toward a promise that grows more mysterious and more compelling with each passing day. And then, when Abram is 75 years old, the voice comes again, clear and unmistakable. Continue on to the land I will show you. And so they do, leaving the familiar comforts of Haran behind and venturing south into a land that will test their faith and reward their patience in ways they cannot yet imagine. When they finally arrive in Canaan, the land that will one day be called the Holy Land, Abram builds his first altar there. It is a simple structure, just stones piled carefully together. But it represents something profound, a declaration that this place, this moment, this act of faith is sacred. Here, in this land of flowing hills and ancient olive trees, Abram is no longer just a wanderer. He is a man with a covenant, a sacred agreement with the divine that will shape not only his own destiny but the destiny of countless generations yet to come. The promise that began in Ur finds its first fulfillment here in Canaan, as Abram becomes Abraham, which means father of many nations, and Sarai becomes Sarah, princess. And though they are still childless, though the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars still seems impossible, they have learned to trust in a timeline that is not their own, in a wisdom that is greater than their understanding. In the quiet of this evening, as we share their story, we can almost hear the echo of that ancient promise still resonating across the centuries, that faith is not about having all the answers, but about being willing to take the next step, that home is not always a place you can point to on a map, but sometimes a promise you carry in your heart, and that the greatest journeys often begin not with a destination in mind, but with the simple courage to say yes to a voice that calls us toward something larger than ourselves. Time flows like a river in our story, dear friend, carrying us forward through the generations. The promise given to Abraham has taken root and grown, just as a single seed planted in fertile soil eventually becomes a mighty tree. Abraham's son Isaac carried the covenant forward, and Isaac's son Jacob, who would one day be called Israel, continued the sacred line. But life, as we all know, rarely follows the straight path we might expect. 400 years have passed since Abraham first heard the voice calling him to Canaan. For centuries of birth and death, of prosperity and hardship, of dreams fulfilled and hopes deferred. And now, in one of history's great ironies, the descendants of Abraham find themselves not in the promised land, but in Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, living not as free people, but as slaves. How did this happen? You might wonder as you settle more comfortably into your rest. It began with a famine, one of those desperate times when the rains fail and the earth grows hard and unyielding. Jacob's family, driven by hunger, had traveled to Egypt, where grain was plentiful, where Jacob's son Joseph had risen to power and could provide for them. What began as a temporary refuge became a permanent settlement, and what started as welcome guests gradually transformed over the long years into an enslaved people. Now, as we join their story again, the children of Israel number in the hundreds of thousands. They are no longer a small family of wanderers, but a nation within a nation. And their very numbers have begun to frighten the pharaohs who rule Egypt. These Hebrew slaves build the great cities and monuments that make Egypt the wonder of the ancient world, but they do so under the whip, under the burning sun, with hearts that ache for freedom and a homeland they have never seen but somehow remember in their dreams. It is into this world of oppression and longing that a child is born, who will change everything. His name is Moses, and from the moment of his birth, his life hangs by the thinnest of threads. Pharaoh, in his fear of the growing Hebrew population, has decreed that all Hebrew baby boys must be killed. But love, as it so often does, finds a way to overcome even the cruelest edicts. Picture, if you will, a young Hebrew mother standing by the banks of the great Nile River in the early morning light. In her arms, she holds a basket woven from reeds and sealed with pitch to make it waterproof. Inside the basket, sleeping peacefully, is her 3-month-old son. She has hidden him as long as she could, but now the danger is too great. With tears streaming down her face and a prayer on her lips, she places the basket among the reeds at the river's edge and watches from a distance as the current carries her most precious treasure toward an uncertain fate. The basket drifts gently downstream until it comes to rest near the place where Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe. When the princess discovers the crying child, her heart is immediately moved with compassion. She knows this must be a Hebrew baby, knows that by rights she should turn away and let fate take its course. But something in the child's cry, something in his bright eyes, touches her soul. She adopts him as her own son, gives him the name Moses, which means drawn from the water, and raises him in the palace as an Egyptian prince. Moses grows up with the best education Egypt can provide, learning the arts of war and peace, studying the mysteries of mathematics and astronomy, speaking the languages of diplomacy and trade. But deep in his heart, he knows he is different. He knows that beyond the palace walls, his people suffer under the burden of slavery. And as he grows older, this knowledge becomes not just an intellectual understanding, but a burning fire in his soul. The moment of truth comes when Moses is 40 years old, a man in the prime of his strength and influence. Walking through the slave quarters one day, he witnesses an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew worker. Something inside Moses snaps. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct and righteous anger, he strikes down the Egyptian and kills him. In that moment, his comfortable life in Pharaoh's palace ends forever. Moses flees Egypt, becoming a fugitive in the wilderness of Midian. For 40 years, he lives as a shepherd, tending flocks in the same desert where his ancestor Abraham once wandered. It is a humbling time, a time of learning and preparation, though Moses does not yet know what he is being prepared for. He marries, has children, grows old watching the sun rise and set over the endless horizon of sand and stone. But God, it seems, is not finished with Moses. One day, while tending his flocks on the slopes of Mount Horeb, Moses sees something that stops him in his tracks. A bush that appears to be on fire but is not being consumed by the flames. As he approaches this marvel, drawn by curiosity and wonder, he hears a voice speaking to him from the burning bush, a voice that echoes with the same authority that once called Abraham from your Moses. Moses, the voice says, and there is infinite tenderness in the way his name is spoken. Here I am, Moses replies, and in those simple words lies a lifetime of preparation and surrender. Take off your sandals, the voice continues, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hides his face, overwhelmed by the presence of the divine, and then he hears words that will change not only his life, but the course of human history. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, the voice continues, the cry of the Israelites has reached Me and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses, now 80 years old, feels the weight of this calling settling on his shoulders like a mantle too heavy to bear. "Who am I," he asks, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" The answer comes with quiet certainty: "I will be with you." What follows is one of the most dramatic confrontations in human history. An aged shepherd, armed with nothing but a staff and an unshakable faith, standing before the most powerful ruler on earth and demanding the freedom of an entire people. Pharaoh, predictably, refuses. "Who is this God that I should obey him?" He asks Mockingly. The answer comes in the form of 10 plagues that strike Egypt with increasing severity, each one a demonstration that there are powers greater than human authority, forces more fundamental than political control. Through it all, Moses stands firm, his voice growing stronger with each confrontation, his faith deepening with each miracle. And finally, after the 10th and most terrible plague, Pharaoh's resistance breaks. "Go," he cries, "take your people and leave my land." The Exodus begins at midnight. 600,000 Hebrew men plus their wives and children, perhaps 2 million people in all, walking out of Egypt under the light of a full moon. They carry with them their few possessions, their hopes, their dreams, and most importantly, the promise that they are going home to a land they have never seen, but that somehow lives in their collective memory. But freedom, as they soon discover, is not a destination but a journey. Pharaoh changes his mind and pursues them with his army. Trapped between the Egyptian chariots and the Red Sea, the people cry out in terror. But Moses, the reluctant leader who has found his voice, raises his staff over the waters. The sea parts, creating a path of dry ground between walls of water, and the children of Israel walk through on dry land to freedom. Behind them, the waters close over Pharaoh's army. Ahead lies the wilderness, 40 years of wandering, testing, and preparation. But they are no longer slaves. They are a free people, carrying with them the law given at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments that will become the foundation of justice for all humanity. As we listen to their story in the quiet of this night, we can almost hear the echo of their footsteps in the sand, the sound of 2 million people walking toward a promise that their children's children would inherit. Moses, the reluctant prince, who became a shepherd, who became the greatest leader in his people's history, guides them not with the certainty of one who knows the way, but with the faith of one who trusts in the promise that there is a way, even when it cannot yet be seen. The wilderness years pass like chapters in a long, slow book, dear friend. 40 years of wandering, 40 years of learning what it means to be free. 40 years of discovering that physical liberation is only the beginning of true freedom. The generation that left Egypt as slaves gradually gives way to a new generation born under the open sky. Children who have never known the weight of chains, but who carry in their hearts the stories of their parents, bondage and liberation. Moses, now 120 years old, but still strong in spirit, stands on Mount Nebo, looking across the Jordan Valley toward the land of Canaan. His eyes, undimmed by age, can see the rolling hills where Abraham once built his altars, the valleys where Isaac dug his wells, the places where Jacob wrestled with angels and received his new name. This is the land promised to their ancestors, the destination toward which they have been traveling for decades. But Moses knows, with the quiet certainty that comes to those who have walked long with the divine, that he will not cross over into the promised land. His work is finished. He has brought the people out of slavery, given them the law, shaped them from a collection of frightened refugees into a nation with a purpose and a destiny. Now it is time for another to take up the mantle of leadership. That man is Joshua, whose name means the Lord saves. He has been Moses' faithful assistant for 40 years, standing beside the great lawgiver through every trial and triumph. Where Moses was reluctant to lead, Joshua is eager to serve. Where Moses was a man of words who spoke with God face to face, Joshua is a man of action who trusts in the divine guidance he has seen demonstrated throughout his lifetime. The passing of leadership from Moses to Joshua is both ceremonial and deeply personal. In front of all the people, Moses lays his hands on Joshua's head and transfers to him the authority to guide the children of Israel. But in the quiet moments before Moses' death, the old leader speaks to his successor with the tenderness of a father to a son. Be strong and courageous, Moses tells Joshua, and these words will echo through Joshua's heart in the difficult days ahead. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. After Moses' death, Joshua faces his first great challenge, crossing the Jordan River. It is springtime, and the river is at flood stage, its waters rushing and turbulent, seemingly impossible to cross with 2 million people, their animals, and their possessions. But Joshua has learned from Moses that impossibility is simply an invitation for the divine to demonstrate its power. Following the instructions he has received, Joshua commands the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant to step into the rushing waters. As their feet touch the riverbank, something miraculous happens. The waters upstream stop flowing, piling up in a great heap, while the waters downstream continue to flow away, leaving a dry riverbed for the people to cross. Can you picture it, dear listener, in the quiet sanctuary of your imagination? 2 million people walking across the bottom of a river, the muddy riverbed firm beneath their feet, walls of water held back by an invisible hand on either side. Children who have never seen such a miracle walking hand in hand with their parents. Elderly people who remember the crossing of the Red Sea 40 years earlier. Everyone moving forward with a mixture of awe and determination toward the land that has lived in their dreams for so long. When the last person has crossed safely to the western bank, the priests carrying the ark step up out of the riverbed, and immediately the waters resume their flow. The Jordan River returns to its normal course. But something has changed forever. The children of Israel are no longer wanderers in the wilderness. They are home, but coming home, they quickly discover, is not the same as being at home. The land of Canaan is not empty, waiting for them to arrive. It is filled with peoples who have lived here for centuries, the Canaanites and Hittites, the Jebusites and Perizzites, the Amorites and Hivites. These are not necessarily evil peoples, but they are peoples with their own gods, their own customs, their own claims to the land. What follows is not a simple conquest, but a complex process of settlement that will take years to complete. Joshua, guided by divine wisdom and his own military genius, leads a campaign that is as much about establishing identity as it is about claiming territory. The most famous victory comes at Jericho, the ancient fortress city that guards the entrance to the hill country. The siege of Jericho unfolds like a ritual more than a battle. For 6 days, the Israelite army marches silently around the city walls once each day, following the Ark of the Covenant, with 7 priests blowing ram's horns. The defenders of Jericho watch from their walls, surely wondering what kind of strange warfare this might be. On the 7th day, they march around the city 7 times. At Joshua's command, the priests blow a long blast on their horns. The people give a great shout, and the walls of Jericho collapse. Not from battering rams or siege engines, but from something far more powerful, the demonstration that there are forces in the universe greater than human fortifications, powers that can accomplish what seems impossible through means that seem absurd. But Joshua's greatest achievement is not military, but organizational. As the conquest proceeds, he must take this collection of 12 tribes, each with its own leadership and traditions, and help them become a unified nation while still preserving their individual identities. It is like conducting an orchestra where each section wants to play its own song, yet somehow creating harmony from diversity. The land is divided among the 12 tribes according to ancient promises and practical needs. Judah receives the southern hill country with its terraced vineyards and olive groves. Benjamin gets a small but strategically important territory that includes the future site of Jerusalem. Ephraim and Manasseh, the descendants of Joseph, inherit the fertile central highlands. Dan and the other tribes settle in their appointed regions, each group bringing its own gifts and challenges to the emerging nation. But perhaps Joshua's most important innovation is the establishment of the cities of refuge, 6 cities scattered throughout the land, where someone who has accidentally killed another person can flee for safety until their case can be judged fairly. It is a revolutionary concept for its time. The idea that justice should be measured and deliberate rather than swift and emotional, that even the guilty deserve protection from vengeance until the truth can be determined. As Joshua grows old, he gathers all the tribes together for a final ceremony at Shechem, the place where Abraham first built an altar in the Promised Land. Under the shade of an ancient oak tree, the aged leader presents the people with a choice that will define their future. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, he tells them, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. The people respond with a great shout of affirmation. We too will serve the Lord, because He is our God. And Joshua sets up a large stone under the oak tree as a witness to their commitment, a reminder for future generations of the choice their ancestors made in that sacred moment. When Joshua dies, at the age of 110, he leaves behind not just a conquered land, but a people who have learned to see themselves as partners with the divine in the great work of creating a just society. They are no longer slaves, no longer wanderers, but settled people with responsibilities and possibilities they are only beginning to understand. The time that follows Joshua's death is remembered as the era of the judges, not judges in our modern sense of legal officials, but charismatic leaders who arise in times of crisis to guide and protect their people. Some are warriors, like Gideon and Samson. Others are prophets, like Samuel. Still others are wise rulers, like Deborah. Each brings their own gifts to the complex task of welding these 12 tribes into something approaching a unified nation. It is a time of both triumph and testing, of faithfulness and falling away, of learning through trial and error what it means to be a people set apart for a sacred purpose. The promised land has been entered, but the promise itself is still unfolding, still revealing new depths and challenges with each passing generation. In the quiet of this evening hour, as we share in this ancient story, we can almost feel the weight of that great stone Joshua set up under the oak tree, still standing as a witness to the power of choice, still reminding us that every generation must decide anew whom they will serve and how they will live. The path opener has done his work, the tribes have found their home, and the next chapter of the story is about to begin. The evening breeze carries whispers across the hills of ancient Israel, where wildflowers still bloom between the weathered stones of forgotten cities. Tonight, we walk with gentle steps into a story of a man chosen by destiny, yet haunted by the very shadows that greatness can cast upon the human heart. In the soft twilight of biblical times, when the last light of day painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the people of Israel found themselves at a crossroads. For generations, they had been guided by judges, wise men and women who spoke with the voice of the Almighty. But now, watching the nations around them with their mighty kings and gleaming armies, the Israelites felt a longing stirring in their collective soul. "Give us a king," they whispered to the prophet Samuel, their voices carrying on the wind like the rustle of olive leaves. "Give us a king like all the nations have." Samuel, his beard silver with the wisdom of years, his eyes holding the depth of one who had spoken with the divine, felt a heaviness settle upon his heart. He knew what they asked for carried both promise and peril, like a beautiful flower that blooms on the edge of a precipice. In the quiet of his dwelling, Samuel heard the voice that had guided him since childhood, gentle as morning mist, yet certain as the sunrise. "Listen to their voices," came the whisper that seemed to flow from the very air around him. "But warn them of what a king will bring." And so it was that Samuel spoke to the people, his words floating over the gathered crowd like leaves falling. In autumn, he told them of the glory that would come, but also of the burdens, how a king would take their sons for his armies. The people listened, but their desire remained strong as the pull of the tide. Somewhere in the tribal lands of Benjamin, in a place where morning dew clung to grass blades like tiny diamonds, lived a young man named Saul. He was tall, this son of Kish, tall enough that when he walked among other men, he stood above them like a cedar among saplings. One whom fortune had touched kindly. Saul knew nothing of kingship on the day that would change his life forever. He was simply searching for his father's lost donkeys, wandering the countryside with his servant, following paths that wound through valleys where shepherds sang ancient songs to their flocks. The sun was warm on his back, and the world seemed filled with nothing more pressing than the gentle urgency of finding wayward animals. "Perhaps we should ask the seer," his servant suggested, as they crested a hill overlooking a small town. "They say there is a man of God here who can tell us where to find what is lost." Neither of them could have imagined that what would be found that day was not merely donkeys, but the destiny of a nation. Samuel saw Saul approaching from a distance, and in that moment, recognition flowed through the old prophet, like water finding its course down a mountainside. This was the one, this tall young man with his easy stride and untroubled countenance. This was Israel's first king. The meeting was gentle, almost ordinary in its simplicity. Samuel invited Saul to dine with him, treated him with the honor due to a guest, and spoke in measured tones about matters that must have seemed curious to the young man from Benjamin. When dawn painted the sky in soft pastels the next morning, Samuel took a small flask of oil, precious and fragrant, and anointed Saul's head while the early light blessed their private ceremony. "You are chosen," Samuel said quietly, his voice holding the weight of prophecy and the tenderness of a father blessing his son. "The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will be changed. You will prophesy with the prophets, and you will become a different man." The Spirit touched him, and he found himself among a company of prophets, his voice joining theirs in songs of praise that seemed to flow from some spring deep within his soul. Those who knew him were amazed. Saul, the farmer's son, prophesying like a holy man. But transformation, we learn from this ancient tale, is both gift and responsibility, both elevation and burden. When the time came to present the new king to all Israel, Samuel gathered the tribes at Mizpah. The ceremony was to be grand, befitting the crowning of their first monarch. But when the moment arrived to bring forth their chosen leader, Saul was nowhere to be found. Picture, if you will, the gentle comedy of that moment. The entire nation gathered for a coronation, and their king-elect hidden away like a shy child at a gathering of elders. They found him at last, crouched among the baggage, his great height making his hiding place almost comically inadequate. "Why do you hide?" they might have asked, though the scriptures record only his emergence, blinking in the sunlight, to face his people. Perhaps even then, in those early moments, Saul felt the first whisper of the shadow that would grow to consume him, the weight of expectation, the fear of failure, the terrible loneliness that can come with standing above others when you feel, in your heart, that you belong among them. When he stood before the multitude, they saw what Samuel had seen it. Man literally head and shoulders above his peers, handsome and strong, every inch the image of what a king should be. "Long live the king," they shouted, their voices echoing across the hills like thunder rolling through valleys. And for a time, Saul was indeed the king they needed. When the Ammonites threatened the city of Jabesh-Gilead, Saul's response was swift and decisive. The spirit of leadership flowed through him like a river in flood season, powerful and purposeful. He gathered an army of thousands, struck the enemy at dawn when the morning mist still clung to the battlefield. Of his early reign, Saul walked in the favor of both God and man. His son Jonathan stood beside him, brave and loyal, a prince whose heart was as noble as his father's crown. Very qualities that make a man great can become the seeds of his downfall. Saul's confidence, which had once served him so well, began to transform into something harder, something that excluded the guidance he had once welcomed. His natural leadership started to calcify into stubborn pride. The first crack in the foundation came during a battle with the Philistines. As the days passed and Samuel did not come, Saul watched his army dwindle, men slipping away in the night like water through his fingers. Fear crept into his heart, not the healthy fear that keeps a man wise, but the corroding fear that makes him desperate. When the seventh day dawned, and still Samuel had not appeared, Saul took the sacrificial offerings and performed the ceremony himself. The smoke rose from the altar, carrying with it something precious that could not be retrieved, the simple trust that, witnessing his child's first great mistake, "What have you done?" he asked. And in those 4 words lay the weight of disappointment that would echo through generations. Saul's explanation came tumbling out: the fleeing soldiers, the approaching enemy, the necessity of the moment. All reasonable, all understandable, all human, and all insufficient to bridge the gap that had opened between obedience and experience. "You have acted foolishly," Samuel said gently, his voice carrying sorrow rather than anger. "If you had kept the command of the Lord your God, he would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not endure." The words settled over Saul like the first frost of winter, beautiful in their terrible clarity, devastating in their finality. Yet the kingdom continued, and Saul remained king. Years passed, filled with victories and defeats, with the complex challenges of ruling a people caught between their calling as God's chosen nation and their desire to be like the kingdoms around them. Saul's administrative skills proved considerable. He organized the military, established trade routes, built fortifications. Under his leadership, Israel became more prosperous and secure than it had been in generations. But the shadow within him continued to grow, fed by a series of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, each one moving him further from the simple trust that had marked his anointing. The final break came during a campaign against the Amalekites, ancient enemies of Israel who had attacked the weak and defenseless during the exodus from Egypt. Samuel delivered God's command clearly: utterly destroy everything, leave nothing alive, take no plunder. It was a harsh commandment, difficult for our modern sensibilities to understand, but clear in its totality. Saul's victory was complete and crushing. The Amalekite army was scattered, their cities captured, their resistance broken. But when the dust settled and Samuel came to congratulate the king on his triumph, the prophet's ears were greeted not by silence, but by the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. "What is this noise of livestock that I hear?" Samuel asked, and perhaps there was still hope in his voice, still a chance for honesty to bridge the growing chasm between them. Saul's response revealed how far he had traveled from the simple young man who had once hidden among the baggage. "The people spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God," he said, his words carefully constructed to shift responsibility while appearing to honor divine purpose. But Samuel, his heart breaking with the weight of watching greatness corrode into self-deception, spoke the words that would haunt both king and kingdom: "To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." The conversation that followed was perhaps one of the most tragic in all of Scripture. Good man, a chosen man, pleading for forgiveness while simultaneously justifying his actions, caught in the terrible trap of pride that makes true repentance impossible. When he finally grasped Samuel's robe in desperation, the fabric tore in his hands, and Samuel said with prophetic gravity, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. The rest of Saul's story unfolds like a classical tragedy, beautiful and terrible in its inevitability. David entered his court, young and musical, his harp strings singing melodies that could soothe the troubled spirit that increasingly tormented the king. For a time, music provided what authority could not, peace for Saul's restless soul. But the shadow had grown too large to be dispelled by melodies, however sweet. When David's victory over Goliath brought him fame that surpassed even the king's, jealousy took root in Saul's heart like a weed in fertile soil. The songs of the people, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, became a refrain that played endlessly in his mind, growing louder with each repetition until it drowned out reason and affection alike. The man who had once prophesied with the prophets began to cast spears at the one whose music had brought him peace. The king who had been chosen by God began to pursue God's newly chosen with the relentless hatred of one who sees his own replacement reflected in another's face. As we draw near the end of this chapter in our gentle journey through ancient Israel, we see Saul in his final years, still powerful, still commanding, but increasingly isolated by the very suspicions and fears that he had allowed to take root in his heart. His son Jonathan remained loyal, but even that relationship was strained by David's presence and the impossible position in which love and duty placed the young Prince Dot in the quiet hours before dawn. When sleep fled from Saul's bed and left him staring into darkness, he must have remembered those early days, the simple mission to find lost donkeys, the unexpected meeting with Samuel, the oil running down his forehead as he was anointed with such hope and promise. Perhaps he wondered at what moment the path had diverged, when the shadow had first appeared to grow beside his light. The tragedy of Saul lies not in any single great evil, but in the accumulation of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable, each one moving him incrementally away from the trust and obedience that had marked his calling. He remained, until the end, a man of considerable talents and genuine accomplishments. Under his leadership, Israel had grown strong and prosperous. He had been a capable administrator, a skilled military commander, and a king who, by most earthly measures, had served his people well. But kingship, as the people of Israel were learning, was about more than earthly success. It was about representing something higher, about embodying the principle that true authority comes not from human strength or wisdom, but from alignment with divine purpose. As the night deepens around us and this chapter of our story draws to its close, we might reflect on Saul not with harsh judgment, but with the compassionate understanding that his struggles are, in many ways, universal human struggles. The pull between independence and obedience, between trusting our own judgment and following guidance that sometimes seems to ask more than we feel capable of giving. These are tensions that every soul knows in the end. Saul's story serves as both warning and comfort. Warning because it shows how gradually and subtly a noble heart can be led astray by pride and fear. Comfort because it reminds us that even in our failures, even in our tragic flaws, we remain part of a larger story, one being written by a hand more skillful than our own. The stars that watched over Saul's troubled sleep still shine tonight, unchanged by the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. The hills where he once walked in the favor of God and man still roll in gentle waves toward the horizon, patient and enduring, holding in their silence the memory of both his glory and his downfall. Tomorrow, in our next chapter, we will meet the young shepherd who would replace him, David, whose heart, despite its own eventual struggles with power and desire, would be called by God a heart after my own heart. But tonight, as we prepare for our own rest, we can pause in grateful recognition that our own stories, whatever their struggles and shortcomings, are held within the same eternal narrative that held Salza's story of divine patience, human frailty, and the endless possibility of redemption that lies just beyond the horizon of our understanding. Sleep well, knowing that the God who chose Saul, despite his ultimate failures, is the same God who chooses us, not because we are perfect, but because love itself is perfect, and in that love, even our most tragic chapters serve purposes we may not fully comprehend until we see them from the other side of eternity. The gentle wind continues to blow across the hills of ancient Israel, carrying with it the whispers of all who have struggled with the weight of calling and the shadow of their own limitations. In that wind, if we listen carefully, we might hear not condemnation, but invitation, the invitation to trust, to obey, and to remember that our worth is not determined by our performance, but by the unchanging love that called us into being and calls us still toward becoming all we were meant to be.
In the quiet hours before dawn, when the first light of morning touches the rolling hills of Judah with fingers of gold and rose, we find ourselves walking along ancient paths where wildflowers bloom eternal between weathered stones. Here, in this timeless landscape where sheep still graze and shepherds still sing, we encounter a story that is echoed through the ages, the story of a boy who became a king, a warrior who was also a poet, a man whose heart was called by the Almighty, himself, a heart after my own heart. The town of Bethlehem sleeps peacefully in the pre-dawn stillness, its limestone houses glowing softly in the early light. In one of these humble dwellings lives Jesse, a man of modest means, but rich in the blessing of sons. 7 strong young. Men call him father, each one capable and worthy in his own right. But this morning, as Samuel the prophet makes his way up the winding path to Bethlehem, carrying with him a horn of oil and the weight of divine instruction, he comes not for any of the 7 sons who might seem obvious choices for greatness. He comes seeking one whose name is not yet spoken among the mighty, whose reputation extends no further than the hillsides where he tends his father's flocks. Samuel's heart still bears the ache of his recent farewell to Saul, but the voice that had spoken to him since childhood had come again. How long will you mourn for Saul? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen one of his sons to be king. One by one, Jesse's sons are presented to the prophet Eliab, tall and impressive. Abinadab, strong and capable. Shammah, whose reputation as a warrior precedes him. Each son more impressive than the last, yet with each introduction, the same gentle voice speaks within Samuel's spirit. Not this one. The prophet learns again that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. When all 7 sons have been presented and none chosen, Samuel asks, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse's response comes with casual air. There remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep. Keeping the sheep. Such simple words to describe the daily life of one who would become the most celebrated king in Israel's history. Picture him there in the rolling pastures outside Bethlehem, this youngest son whose name his father almost forgot to mention. The morning sun warms his shoulders as he guides his flock to fresh grazing, his shepherd's staff smooth in his hand from years of faithful use. In his other hand rests the simple harp that has become his constant companion in these solitary hours. His fingers pick out melodies that seem to flow from the very landscape around him, songs that speak of hills that skip like rams in their joy, of green pastures and still waters, of a shepherd who watches over all. The years of solitude have not been empty for this young shepherd. He has learned patience from waiting through long nights when danger threatened. He has learned courage from facing down lions and bears who would steal from his flock. He has learned responsibility from the daily rhythm of providing for creatures who depend entirely upon his care. Most importantly, he has learned to sing. When the summons comes from his father's house, David responds with simple obedience. Samuel sees him coming, and immediately the prophet's spirit quickens with recognition. Here is no impressive physical specimen like Saul had been, but in David's bright eyes, Samuel recognizes a quality of soul that cannot be manufactured, the look of one whose heart has been shaped by solitude and responsibility, by intimate communion with the God who made all things. Rise and anoint him, comes the voice within Samuel's spirit. This is the one. The anointing itself is simple. With David's family watching in wonder, Samuel takes the horn of oil and pours it over the young shepherd's head. In that moment, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon David with power and permanence. The oil soaks into his hair, but more importantly, the calling soaks into his soul. After Samuel's departure, David returns to his sheep. Nothing in his external circumstances has changed, but everything has changed nonetheless. The boy who walks back to the pastures carries within him the secret knowledge of destiny, that it is during these peaceful days that news reaches Bethlehem of troubling developments in King Saul's court. The Spirit of the Lord has departed from the king, leaving behind dark influences. Saul now struggles with moods that swing between melancholy and rage. His servants suggest finding a skilled musician to soothe the king's troubled spirit. Recommendation comes for Jesse's youngest son, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence. And the Lord is with him. When David arrives at Saul's court, a relationship of genuine affection develops between the tormented king and the young musician. When dark moods descend upon Saul, David takes his harp and plays. His music carries all the peace he has absorbed during his years in the hills. Under the influence of these melodies, Saul finds relief from his torment. But it is during one of David's periods back home in Bethlehem that the moment arrives which will transform him from court musician to national hero. The Philistines have gathered their armies, and from their camp emerges a giant Goliath of Gath, over 9 feet tall, whose very appearance inspires terror. Day after day, Goliath issues the same challenge: single combat to determine the fate of nations. But no man in Israel's army steps forward. Even Saul finds himself paralyzed by the giant's overwhelming presence. Into this atmosphere of fear arrives David, carrying provisions to his brothers in Saul's army. When Goliath emerges and begins his daily taunts, David experiences genuine shock and outrage. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" David asks with innocent directness, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Where others see an impossible military challenge, David sees a spiritual crisis. His questions persist with relentless logic, eventually reaching King Saul's ears. When David offers to fight the giant, Saul responds with reasonable skepticism. "You are but a youth," and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David's confidence rests on experience. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," he explains matter-of-factly. "And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and killed it." For David, protecting what has been entrusted to his care is simply necessary, regardless of personal risk. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, David concludes with absolute certainty, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul gives his consent and offers his own armor, but after trying it on, David recognizes its futility. I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. He will face the giant not with borrowed armor, but with the tools that have served him faithfully. He will be an authentic shepherd, trusting in proven skills and faith. Stripping off Saul's armor, David selects 5 smooth stones from a brook and places them in his shepherd's pouch. With his sling in hand and faith in his heart, he walks onto the battlefield. Goliath's reaction reveals both amusement and insult. Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? But David's response rings across the valley with clear certainty. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. David continues with prophetic certainty, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. With these words hanging in the air, David breaks into a run toward the advancing giant. As Goliath bears down upon him, David reaches into his pouch, selects a stone, places it in his sling, and with fluid motion perfected through countless hours of practice, sends the stone flying toward its target. The stone strikes Goliath in the forehead with devastating accuracy. The giant falls face first to the earth with a crash that echoes across the valley. David runs to where Goliath lies, draws the giant's own sword, and completes what the stone began. The effect on both armies is immediate. The Philistines flee while the Israelites pursue with fierce joy, knowing themselves to be on the winning side of history. When King Saul asks whose son he is, David's answer reveals that his fundamental identity remains unaltered by fame. I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Not, I am David the giant killer, but simply the son of Jesse, identifying himself through relationship rather than achievement. This response reveals something essential about the heart God called a heart after my own heart. Even in his moment of greatest triumph, David understands that his victory belongs to God, that his identity rests not in what he has accomplished, but in whose he is not. As we close this chapter, we might reflect on what David's story reveals about greatness as God defines it. It is the greatness of faithfulness in small things that prepares us for faithfulness in great things. The foundation laid in these early chapters: faithful service, divine communion, willingness to risk everything for God's honor, will sustain David through all the complexities ahead. The same God who took a shepherd boy and prepared him for kingship is still at work in the quiet places of our own lives, still using faithful service in small things to prepare us for purposes we cannot yet imagine. No act of faithfulness is too small to matter, no trust too simple to be honored, and no heart too humble to be used for great and beautiful purposes in the ongoing story of divine love. In the gentle hours before the world awakens, when dewdrops catch the first rays of sunlight like diamonds scattered across ancient stones, we find ourselves standing on a hill overlooking one of humanity's most sacred spaces. Below us, wrapped in the soft mists of early morning, lies a city that has been called by many names throughout the ages: Zion, the city of David, Salem the peaceful, Yerushalayim the foundation of peace. But to those who have walked its narrow streets and prayed within its walls, it is simply Jerusalem, a word that carries within it the weight of eternity and the whisper of divine presence. This morning, as the first light touches the limestone walls that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, we are invited to walk gently through the story of how this ancient stronghold became the beating heart of a people's faith, the place where heaven and earth seemed to touch with particular tenderness. Long before David set his eyes upon these hills, Jerusalem existed as a fortress city of the Jebusites, a people whose name has faded from common memory, but whose engineering skills created something that would endure for millennia. Perched on Mount Zion, surrounded by valleys that provided natural defense, the city seemed almost to grow from the living rock itself, its walls following the contours of the ridge, like stone petals of some enormous flower blooming from the earth. The Jebusites had chosen their location well. Water flowed from the Gihon spring at the base of the eastern slope, providing the most precious resource any ancient city could possess, a reliable source of fresh water that could sustain a population even during times of siege. The hills rose steeply on three sides, making assault difficult for any army brave enough to attempt it. From the highest points of the city, watchmen could see for miles in every direction, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of approaching friends or enemies. For centuries, this fortress had stood unconquered, its inhabitants living in the security that comes from occupying what seems to be an impregnable position. Trade routes passed through the valleys below, bringing wealth and news from distant lands. Caravans rested in the shadows of Jerusalem's walls, their merchants perhaps gazing up at the formidable fortifications and wondering what treasures lay hidden behind those silent stones. But cities, like people, have destinies that extend beyond their apparent circumstances. What the Jebusites saw as permanent security, divine providence viewed as temporary stewardship. The city that seemed destined to remain a footnote in the chronicles of Canaanite civilization was about to become the stage for some of history's most profound spiritual dramas. When David first approached Jerusalem as the newly anointed king of all Israel, he came not as a conqueror driven by mere ambition, but as a man seeking to fulfill a vision that had been growing in his heart since his shepherd days in the hills of Judah. The boy who had once gazed up at the stars from beside his father's sheep had dreamed of a place where all the tribes of Israel could gather as one people, where the presence of God could dwell among them in a way that would make their unity visible to all the nations of the earth. The choice of Jerusalem as his capital was inspired by more than military strategy, though the strategic advantages were considerable. David understood that to truly unite the 12 tribes of Israel, he needed a city that belonged to no single tribe, a neutral ground where Judah and Benjamin, Ephraim and Manasseh could all feel equally at home. Jerusalem, still in the hands of the Jebusites, offered that possibility a fresh start, a clean slate upon which the story of united Israel could be written. The siege of Jerusalem was unlike the dramatic battle with Goliath that had made David famous. This was a more subtle conquest, requiring not just courage but cunning, not just strength but wisdom. The Jebusites, confident in their fortress walls, taunted David's forces with crude humor. "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking that even their weakest citizens could defend such a stronghold. But David, the former shepherd who had learned patience during long nights watching over his flock, understood that every fortress has its weakness, every strength its corresponding vulnerability. The very water system that made Jerusalem impregnable also provided a way in for those clever enough to find it and brave enough to use it. Joab, David's nephew and most trusted military commander, led a small group of warriors through the water shaft that connected the city to the Gihon spring. In the darkness before dawn, while the city slept secure in its imagined safety, these men climbed through the narrow tunnel, emerging inside the walls like ghosts materializing from the living rock. The conquest that followed was swift and decisive, but also merciful. David took the city not with the wholesale destruction that often marked ancient warfare, but with the measured force of one who understood that he was claiming not just a military prize, but a sacred trust. The Jebusites who chose to remain were integrated into the expanding kingdom, their engineering knowledge and intimate familiarity with the city systems proving valuable to their new king. When the gates of Jerusalem opened to admit David and his retinue, The moment marked more than a military victory. It represented the fulfillment of promises made generations earlier, the realization of dreams that had sustained the children of Israel through centuries of wandering and struggle. Here, at last, was a place they could call truly home, not just a temporary encampment or a conquered territory, but a city that would become the physical embodiment of their covenant with the Almighty. David's first acts as Jerusalem's new Lord revealed his understanding of the city's deeper significance. Rather than simply occupying the existing Jebusite structures, he began immediately to expand and beautify the city, transforming a utilitarian fortress into something worthy of its destined role as the center of Israelite civilization. The construction projects that followed were inspired by more than royal vanity. Each stone laid, each wall raised, each courtyard paved represented David's vision of what Jerusalem could become, a city that would draw pilgrims from the ends of the earth, a place where justice would flow like water and righteousness like a mighty stream, a earthly reflection of heavenly order and beauty. Skilled craftsmen were summoned from throughout the known world. Hiram of Tyre, whose reputation for excellence had spread from Phoenicia to Egypt, sent cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon, wood so aromatic that its fragrance would perfume the air for generations. Stonemasons who had learned their craft in the great cities of Mesopotamia came to carve the limestone of Jerusalem into forms that would please both human eyes and divine approval. But the most significant construction project of David's early reign in Jerusalem was not a building but a homecoming. In the hills of Judah, in the house of Abinadab, the Ark of the Covenant had rested for 20 years, its golden cherubim silent witnesses to Israel's struggles and triumphs. This sacred chest, containing the stone tablets of the law given to Moses, Aaron's rod that had budded, and a pot of manna from the wilderness years, represented the very presence of God among his people. David understood that without the ark, Jerusalem would be merely another fortified city, impressive perhaps, but lacking the spiritual dimension that would make it truly significant. With the ark dwelling within its walls, Jerusalem would become the focal point of Israelite worship, the place where heaven touched earth in a way that could be experienced by every seeking soul. The journey to bring the ark to Jerusalem became a celebration that revealed the depths of David's joy and devotion. This was no solemn funeral procession, but a festival of praise that transformed the roads between Judah and Jerusalem into rivers of music and dancing. David himself, a king who might have maintained royal dignity, danced before the ark with such abandon that his own wife criticized him for undignified behavior. But David's response revealed the heart that God had recognized and chosen. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. For him, no expression of joy could be too exuberant when celebrating the return of God's presence to dwell among his people. The procession moved slowly, stopping every 6 paces for sacrifices of thanksgiving, the air filled with the sound of harps and lyres, tambourines and cymbals, the voices of thousands lifted in songs that seemed to make the very hills ring with praise. When the ark finally entered Jerusalem, passing through gates that had been widened to accommodate the celebration, the city itself seemed to exhale with relief and satisfaction, as if it had been holding its breath until this moment of completion. The temporary tent that David erected to house the ark was simple compared to the elaborate temples of other nations, but it served a purpose that no architectural grandeur could match. Here, in this humble structure, the presence of the living God took up residence in the heart of Israel's new capital. Morning and evening, the smoke of sacrifice rose toward heaven, carrying with it the prayers and praises of a people who finally had a place to call home. In the years that followed, Jerusalem grew and flourished under David's wise leadership. The narrow streets that had once echoed only with the footsteps of Jebusite guards now hummed with the voices of merchants and pilgrims, artisans and scholars. priests and prophets. Markets sprang up in every available courtyard, their stalls displaying goods from distant land, spices from Arabia, textiles from Damascus, precious stones from the mountains of Ethiopia. The city became a magnet for talent and ambition, but also for those seeking something deeper than material prosperity. Poets and musicians gathered in Jerusalem, drawn by David's own reputation as a composer of psalms. Young men who felt called to serve God found their way to the city, hoping to join the growing number of priests and Levites who maintained the worship in the tent of meeting. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the character of the city's daily life. Where once the narrow confines of a military fortress had bred suspicion and defensiveness, the expanding city of David fostered a spirit of openness and hospitality. The gates that had once been barred against all outsiders now welcomed travelers from every nation, as long as they came in peace. The judicial system that David established in Jerusalem became renowned throughout the ancient world for its fairness and wisdom. The king himself held court regularly, listening to disputes between citizens and rendering decisions with the same careful attention he had once given to his father's sheep. His judgments were guided not by favoritism or political expediency, but by the principles of justice and mercy that he found written in the law of Moses and confirmed in his own communion with the divine. Water systems were expanded and improved, ensuring that the growing population would never lack for this most basic necessity. Gardens were planted on every available terrace, filling the air with the fragrance of roses and jasmine, providing quiet spaces where citizens could escape the bustle of urban life and remember the beauty of the natural world that surrounded. Their city schools were established, where young people could learn not only the practical skills they would need as adults, but also the stories and songs that preserved their identity as the chosen people of God. The elderly were honored and cared for, their wisdom valued as much as the strength of young warriors. Widows and orphans found protection under laws that recognized their vulnerability and provided for their needs. As word of Jerusalem's prosperity and justice spread throughout the region, delegations began arriving from distant kingdoms. There, leaders curious to see for themselves this city that seemed to combine material success with spiritual depth in ways that challenged conventional understanding. Many came expecting to find either wealth without morality or piety without practical competence. Instead, they discovered a society that seemed to embody both earthly wisdom and heavenly vision. The architectural beauty of Jerusalem during David's reign was not the cold perfection of monuments to human pride, but the warm attractiveness of a city designed for human flourishing. Buildings were constructed not just to impress visitors, but to serve the daily needs of families and communities. Public spaces were created where children could play safely and adults could gather for conversation and fellowship. The walls that David built around Jerusalem were strong enough to deter potential enemies, but they were also beautiful enough to serve as a source of civic pride. Towers rose at strategic intervals, their height providing both military advantage and visual appeal. Gates were decorated with carvings that told the story of Israel's journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. But the true beauty of Jerusalem lay not in its physical structures, impressive though they were, but in the quality of life it fostered for its inhabitants. This was a city where justice rolled down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, where the weak found protection and the strong found purpose and service to something greater than themselves. In the early morning hours, when the first light of dawn touched the golden stones of Jerusalem's walls, the city awakened not to the harsh commands of overseers or the clash of weapons, but to the gentle sounds of daily life beginning again. Mothers singing to their children, merchants calling their wares, priests chanting the morning prayers that rose like incense toward heaven. The aroma that filled Jerusalem's air was a mixture of cedar wood from the palaces, incense from the tabernacle, bread from the ovens, and flowers from the gardens. Blend that spoke of abundance and beauty, of material blessing and spiritual richness combined in harmonious proportion. Children grew up in Jerusalem, knowing themselves to be part of something larger than their individual families or tribal affiliations. They were citizens of the city of God, inheritors of promises made to Abraham and Moses, participants in a grand adventure that would unfold across generations yet to come. As evening approached each day, the setting sun painted Jerusalem's limestone, walls and shades of gold and rose, transforming the entire city into a jewel set in the crown of the Judean hills. From the highest towers, the view extended in every direction north toward the tribal territories of Benjamin and Ephraim, south toward the wilderness where David had once wandered as a fugitive, east toward the Jordan Valley and the lands beyond, west toward the Mediterranean Sea and the great civilizations that bordered its shores. But the most significant view from Jerusalem's heights was not horizontal, but vertical upward toward the heavens that declared the glory of God, and inward toward the hearts of a people who had finally found their true home. Here, in this city that seemed to bridge earth and heaven, the ancient promises were being fulfilled in ways that exceeded even the boldest dreams of the patriarchs. Tonight, as we prepare for our own rest, we can find comfort in remembering that the Jerusalem of David's time was more than a historical curiosity or archaeological site. It was a glimpse of what human civilization can become when it is founded on principles of justice and mercy, when it recognizes the dignity of every person and the sovereignty of divine love. The stones of ancient Jerusalem have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the triumph and tragedy of human ambition, the persistence of hope even in the darkest hours of history. But through all these changes, the vision that David embodied in his city continues to inspire those who seek to build communities that reflect heavenly values in earthly circumstances. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the same divine presence that dwelt in David's Jerusalem still moves through our world, still calls us to be builders of justice and mercy, still invites us to participate in the great work of creating spaces where all of God's children can flourish and find their true home. The evening breeze carries the scent of frankincense and myrrh through the ancient streets of Jerusalem, and as the sun sets behind the western hills, golden light dances across limestone walls that have witnessed wonders beyond imagination. Tonight, dear listener, we journey to a time when the very stones of Jerusalem sang with joy, when the dream of a father became the magnificent reality of a son, and when the presence of the divine descended upon a temple built not just with hands, but with the devotion of an entire people. In the peaceful decades following King David's reign, his son Solomon ascended to the throne of Israel. The young king inherited more than just a crown. He inherited his father's deepest wish, a sacred promise made to God himself. David, the warrior poet who had unified the tribes and conquered Jerusalem, had dreamed of building a house for the Lord, a permanent dwelling place to replace the traveling tent that had sheltered the Ark of the Covenant through 40 years of desert wandering. Yet God had spoken gently to David, saying that his hands, stained with the blood of necessary battles, would not be the ones to build this holy place. Instead, this honor would fall to his son, a king whose reign would be marked not by warfare, but by wisdom, prosperity, and peace. And so it was that Solomon, whose very name means peace, would fulfill his father's most cherished dream. The young king understood the weight of this divine commission. This would not be merely a building of stone and wood. It would be the earthly throne room of the Almighty, a place where heaven and earth would meet in perfect harmony. Solomon knew that everything about this temple must reflect the glory and majesty of the one who would dwell there. And so, in the 4th year of his reign, when the spring rains had ended and the summer sun had dried the earth, Solomon began the greatest construction project in the history of his people. The site chosen was Mount Moriah, the very hill where tradition held that Abraham had once raised his knife above his beloved son Isaac, only to find God's provision of a ram caught in the thicket. This sacred ground would now become the foundation for something even more wondrous. The logistics of such an undertaking were staggering. Solomon dispatched messengers to King Hiram of Tyre, his father's old friend and ally. The mountains of Lebanon held treasures that no other land could provide: mighty cedar trees, some over 1,000 years old, their trunks so vast that 20 men holding hands could barely encircle them. These ancient giants, their wood fine-grained and aromatic, resistant to decay and insects, would form the bones of God's house. Hiram agreed to the partnership with enthusiasm, and soon the mountains of Lebanon rang with the sound of axes and saws. Skilled Phoenician woodsmen, masters of their craft, selected only the finest trees. Each massive trunk was carefully prepared, shaped and numbered before being loaded onto great rafts and floated down the Mediterranean coast to the port city of Joppa. From there, teams of oxen dragged the precious timber up the winding roads to Jerusalem, a procession that must have looked like a parade of giants. But wood alone, however magnificent, would not suffice for this holy purpose. Solomon's orders went out across his kingdom and beyond. Quarries in the hills around Jerusalem began producing blocks of limestone, each one cut to precise specifications. Master masons worked with such skill that, when the stones reached the Temple Mount, they fit together perfectly without the need for hammer or chisel. The very construction site was kept in reverent silence, befitting the sacred nature of the work. From the mines of his kingdom came copper in abundance, and from distant trading partners came precious metals. Gold arrived by caravan and ship not, mere ounces or pounds, but literally tons of the precious metal. Silver flowed in like water. Skilled craftsmen from across the known world were recruited, their expertise making up for what the Israelites lacked in certain specialized techniques. As the months turned to years, the temple began to rise from the rocky summit of Mount Moriah. Its orientation was precise, the entrance facing east, toward the rising sun, symbol of God's eternal presence and new mercies that come with each dawn. The structure itself followed a simple but profound design. A rectangular building divided into 3 main sections, each representing a different level of holiness. The first section, which visitors entered through magnificent doors of olive wood overlaid with gold, was called the Ulam, the porch, or vestibule. Here stood 2 massive bronze pillars, each given a name: Yakin, meaning he establishes, and Boaz, meaning in him is strength. These pillars, over 25 feet tall and topped with lily-shaped capitals, proclaimed to all who entered that this house was established by God's power and would endure through his strength. Beyond the porch lay the holy place, the Hikal, stretching 40 cubits in length. This was the daily workplace of the priests, where they would offer incense each morning and evening, tend the 7-branched golden lampstand that burned continuously, and place the fresh bread of the presence each Sabbath on the golden table. The walls here were covered in cedar wood, every panel carved with intricate designs of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers, the very Garden of Eden, brought to life in wood and overlaid with the purest gold. The floors beneath the priests' feet were made of cypress wood, also covered with gold, so that every step they took was upon ground that literally reflected heaven's glory. Golden chains hung across the room, and the warm light from the lampstand danced across surfaces that seemed to glow with inner fire. At the western end of the holy place, behind a veil of finest linen dyed in blue, purple, and scarlet, lay the most sacred space of all the Holy of Holies, the Debir. This was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in each direction, its walls lined with cedar and overlaid with 600 talents of the finest gold. Here, in the thick darkness broken only by the Shekinah glory of God himself, stood the Ark of the Covenant, flanked by two magnificent cherubim carved from olive wood and covered in gold. These cherubim were not the chubby infants of later art, but mighty angelic beings, each 15 feet tall, their wings outstretched so that they touched both the walls and each other above the ark. Their faces were turned toward the golden mercy seat that topped the ark, as if they too were worshippers in this most holy place. The temple's beauty was not confined to its interior. The exterior walls were built of massive limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between them. The roof was covered with cedar beams and gold, so that the entire structure gleamed like a jewel in the morning sun. Surrounding the temple was a complex of courtyards and additional buildings. The inner courtyard, where the great bronze altar stood, was paved with stones and surrounded by a wall with gates of bronze. Here the priests would offer the daily sacrifices, the smoke of which rose like incense to heaven. The outer courtyard could accommodate thousands of worshippers who came from across Israel and even from foreign lands to seek the blessing of the God of Israel. For 7 years the work continued, each day bringing new wonders. Skilled metal workers cast the great bronze ca, a circular basin 15 feet across and over 7 feet deep, supported by 12 bronze oxen facing outward toward the 4 corners of the earth. This immense basin, holding thousands of gallons of water, was where the priests would wash before performing their sacred duties. Smaller bronze lavers on wheeled stands could be moved about the courtyard as needed. Golden bowls, silver trumpets, bronze instruments of every kind, everything needed for the elaborate rituals of worship, was crafted with care and precision. Even the smallest details received attention worthy of their divine purpose. As the construction neared completion, Solomon must have stood often on the Temple Mount, watching the sun set behind the golden roof, marveling at what human hands guided by divine wisdom had accomplished. This was more than architecture, it was theology. In stone and wood, a sermon that would preach to generation after generation about the majesty, holiness, and beauty of the God of Israel. The temple was not just a building but a symbol. Its very existence declared to the world that Israel's God was not a distant deity dwelling in unreachable heavens, but one who chose to dwell among his people. The elaborate rituals performed within its walls would remind every worshiper that approaching the divine required reverence, preparation, and an understanding of one's own unworthiness apart from God's grace. When the work was finally completed, in the 11th year of Solomon's reign, the temple stood as the crown jewel of Jerusalem, visible from miles away, its golden surfaces catching and reflecting the light of sun and moon. Pilgrims approaching the city would see it gleaming on the horizon long before they could make out any other buildings, a beacon calling them to worship. The dedication ceremony, when Solomon would formally present this magnificent structure to the Lord, would be a celebration unlike any the world had ever seen. But tonight, as we imagine the temple in its pristine glory, let us rest in the knowledge that human hands, guided by divine love, can create beauty that points beyond itself to eternal truths. The temple Solomon built was more than the sum of its golden walls and cedar beams. It was a statement of faith, a declaration that the invisible God of Israel was worthy of the most beautiful dwelling place that human skill and devotion could create. And in its construction, we see reflected the truth that when we offer our best to God, our finest materials, our most skilled craftsmen, our deepest devotion, He accepts and blesses the work of our hands. As the night deepens over Jerusalem, and the temple stands silent and golden in the moonlight, we can almost hear the whispered prayers of the craftsmen who built it, the songs of the priests who would serve in it, and the grateful worship of the thousands who would find peace within its courts. For in the end, Solomon's temple was not just a building, but a bridge between earth and heaven, a place where mortal hearts could touch the eternal and find rest in the presence of the divine God. And so tonight, as we close our eyes and let the gentle rhythm of our breathing carry us toward sleep, we carry with us the image of that first temple golden, beautiful, and wholly a reminder that even in our imperfect world, there are places and moments where the sacred breaks through, where beauty points us toward truth, and where the longing of the human heart finds its perfect answer in the presence of God in the soft darkness of night. Let us rest in the peace that Solomon's temple represented, the peace of a people who knew their God dwelt among them, the peace of hearts that had found their true home, and the peace that comes when human devotion meets divine grace in perfect harmony. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with golden light and the whispered promise that the God who once dwelt in a temple made with hands now makes his dwelling in every heart that welcomes him. The temple sleeps in the moonlight, its stones holding memories of glory, and we too can rest, knowing that some things built in faith and love endure beyond the passing of empires and the turning of ages. In the quiet of night, the ancient stones still sing their song of dedication, devotion, and the eternal presence of the divine among his people. The golden age of Solomon's reign had come to an end, and with it, the last days of the united kingdom of Israel. As the great king lay dying in his palace, the very stones of Jerusalem seemed to whisper with uncertainty. A magnificent temple still gleamed on Mount Moriah, its golden walls catching the last rays of sunlight, but shadows were gathering that would soon change the course of history forever. Solomon had ruled for 40 years, and during that time, his kingdom had grown rich and powerful beyond the dreams of his father David. Trade routes crisscrossed his lands, bringing gold from Ophir, spices from Arabia, and wisdom from distant courts. Yet this prosperity had come at a price that would soon demand payment in full. The burden of Solomon's grand projects, the temple, his palace, the fortified cities, and the vast bureaucracy needed to govern such an empire, had fallen heavily upon the shoulders of his people. Heavy taxes and extensive labor demands had created simmering resentment throughout the kingdom. The northern tribes especially felt the weight of these burdens, as they provided much of the forced labor that built Solomon's wonders. When Solomon's son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, the kingdom stood at a crossroads. The people looked to their new king with hope that he might ease the heavy yoke his father had placed upon them. But Rehoboam, young and inexperienced, would make a decision that would split the nation and echo through the centuries. The coronation was to take place in Shechem, an ancient city in the hill country of Ephraim, rather than in Jerusalem. This choice of location was significant. Shechem was where Abraham had first built an altar to the Lord in the Promised Land, where Jacob had returned from his exile, and where Joshua had renewed the covenant between Israel and their God. It was a place of new beginnings, and perhaps the tribal leaders hoped would mark a new beginning for their relationship with the crown. From Egypt came Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had fled Solomon's court years earlier when the old king discovered his growing influence among the northern tribes. Jeroboam had been a capable administrator, overseeing the forced labor of the house of Joseph, but his growing popularity had made Solomon suspicious. Now he returned at the invitation of the tribal elders to speak for the people. The assembled leaders of Israel came before Rehoboam with a petition that was both reasonable and urgent. They spoke with the dignity of free men who had served faithfully, but whose patience had worn thin. "Your father made our yoke heavy," they said. "Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you." It was a moment pregnant with possibility. Here was a chance for Rehoboam to show wisdom beyond his years, to heal the wounds that had festered during his father's later years, and to unite the kingdom in a new spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. The elders who had served Solomon came to the young king with counsel born of experience. "If you will be a servant to this people today, and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, Then they will be your servants forever." 3 days, Rehoboam deliberated. He could have walked among the people, listened to their stories, felt the calluses on their hands from years of unpaid labor. He could have visited the northern territories and seen firsthand how the burden of empire had fallen unequally upon different regions. But instead, he remained in his chambers, torn between competing voices. The older counselors spoke of the wisdom of compromise, of the strength that comes from the willing loyalty of one's subjects. But the young men who had grown up with Rehoboam in the palace whispered different advice. They spoke of the weakness of yielding to pressure, of the danger of appearing soft before the people. "Show them your strength," they urged. "Make them know who rules here." When the 3 days had passed, Rehoboam emerged to give his answer. The people gathered in the great assembly, tribal leaders and common folk alike, waiting to hear words that would shape their future. What they heard would shatter the kingdom that David had built and Solomon had glorified. "My father made your yoke heavy," Rehoboam declared, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and anger through the assembly. The petition for reduced taxation was not just refused, it was answered with a promise of even greater burdens. The young king had chosen to rule through fear rather than love, through force rather than wisdom. The response was immediate and decisive. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, declared their independence from the house of David. "What portion have we in David?" they cried. "We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Look now to your own house." David! The united monarchy split into 2 separate kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And so, in the year 930 BCE, the kingdom that had been united under David and Solomon was divided. The northern kingdom, often called Israel or sometimes Ephraim, after its most powerful tribe, encompassed 10 of the 12 tribes. Rehoboam retained only the tribe of Judah and most of the tribe of Benjamin, forming the southern kingdom of Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. Jeroboam, now king of the northern kingdom, faced challenges that would test his wisdom and faith. His kingdom was larger and more populous than Judah, blessed with fertile valleys and important trade routes. But it also faced a serious problem. The temple in Jerusalem, now in foreign territory, remained the center of worship for all Israel. If his people continued to go to Jerusalem for the great festivals, Jeroboam feared they might be drawn back to the house of David. His solution was both politically clever and spiritually disastrous. Jeroboam created 2 golden calves and placed them in the ancient sacred sites of Bethel and Dan, telling his people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The words were almost identical to those spoken by Aaron during the wilderness wanderings, and they would prove just as destructive to the spiritual life of the people. The division of the kingdom brought changes that rippled through every aspect of life in the land. Families found themselves separated by new borders. Trade routes that had flowed freely now required negotiations between rival kingdoms. The unified vision that had driven the conquest of the land and the building of the temple was replaced by the smaller concerns of competing states. In Jerusalem, Rehoboam looked out from his palace windows at a kingdom much reduced from what his grandfather David had built. The temple still stood in all its glory, but it now served a much smaller realm. The golden age of Solomon had given way to an age of division, where brother faced brother across borders drawn by pride and stubbornness. Yet even in this division, the hand of providence could be seen at work. The prophets declared that this split had been ordained by God as judgment for Solomon's later unfaithfulness. When the wise king had been led astray by his foreign wives and had built high places for their gods. The split was prophesied by the Lord because of Solomon's sin. They said, and what seemed like political upheaval was actually divine justice, working itself out in human affairs. The two kingdoms would coexist for the next 2 centuries, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, but always as reminders of what had been lost when wisdom gave way to pride, when the advice of the aged was rejected for the counsel of youth, when the desire to rule overcame the calling to serve. In the long nights that followed the division, the people of both kingdoms would look up at the same stars that had shone over the united realm of David and Solomon. They would remember the songs of celebration that had echoed through Jerusalem. When the temple was dedicated, when all Israel had been one people under one God, worshiping in one sacred place. The kingdom was divided, but the promises of God remained. In both north and south, faithful hearts continued to seek the Lord, to remember the covenant, and to hope for a day when the wounds of division might be healed. The temple in Jerusalem continued to welcome pilgrims from both kingdoms, for the love of God transcended the boundaries drawn by human conflict. As the years passed, the division that had seemed so sharp and final began to be seen as part of a larger tapestry being woven by the hand of the Almighty. From the northern kingdom would come powerful prophets like Elijah and Elisha, voices calling the people back to faithfulness. From the southern kingdom would come the line of David, carrying forward the promise of a coming king who would one day unite not just the tribes of Israel, but all the peoples of the earth. And so, as we rest in the quiet of night, we remember that even in division, God's purposes continue to unfold. The kingdom may have been split by human pride and folly, but the kingdom of heaven remains unshaken. In the end, the story of Israel's divided monarchy is not just about political failure, but about the patience of God, who works through human weakness to accomplish his eternal purposes. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that though kingdoms may rise and fall, though human wisdom may fail and human pride may divide, the God who called Abraham, who delivered Israel from Egypt, and who filled Solomon's temple with his glory, remains faithful to his promises. In the gentle darkness, let us rest in the assurance that what man divides, God can unite, and what seems like an ending is often just a new beginning in disguise. The stars that shone over the divided kingdom still shine tonight, reminding us that above all human kingdoms stands the eternal kingdom of heaven, where perfect justice and perfect mercy meet, and where all the faithful, from both north and south, from every tribe and nation, will one day gather in perfect unity around the throne of the King of Kings. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rises from the hills of Judah and the olive groves whisper with the morning breeze, there comes a sound that is both ancient and eternal, the voice of one calling in the wilderness. Tonight, dear listener, we turn our hearts toward those remarkable souls who stood like beacons in the growing darkness of Israel's divided kingdom, the prophets who carried the very words of the Almighty to a people who had begun to forget their first love. Division of the kingdom had brought more than political upheaval. It had created a spiritual crisis that would echo through the centuries. In both north and south, the pure worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was being diluted with foreign practices, corrupted by the influence of neighboring nations, and sometimes abandoned altogether in favor of the golden calves and high places that promised easier paths to prosperity and power. But God had not abandoned his people. Into this spiritual wasteland he sent his messengers, men and women whose hearts burned with divine fire, whose ears had heard the whisper of eternity, and whose voices would not be silenced, even when kings and princes sought to silence them. These were the prophets, the seers, the watchmen on the walls of Israel, and their stories are woven through the divided kingdom like golden threads in a tapestry that might otherwise have been all shadow and sorrow. From the northern kingdom came Elijah, whose very name meant, "My God is the Lord." He lived during the reign of King Ahab in the 9th century BC, when the worship of Baal had spread like a poison through the land. Elijah appeared in the court of Ahab like a desert wind, his clothes simple, his manner direct, his message unmistakable. There was only one true God, and Israel had forgotten him. The confrontation on Mount Carmel became the stuff of legend. 450 prophets of Baal, arrayed against one solitary figure who served the God of Israel. All day long the false prophets called upon their deity, dancing around their altar, cutting themselves with knives, crying out until their voices were hoarse. But there was no answer, no voice, no fire from heaven. When evening came, Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, arranged the wood, placed the sacrifice upon it, and then, to make the miracle unmistakable, ordered that it be drenched with water until the very trenches around the altar were filled. Then, in the hearing of all Israel, he prayed a prayer so simple and so profound that it still echoes in the hearts of the faithful. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant. The fire that fell from heaven consumed not only the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar, and even the water in the trenches. The people fell on their faces, crying, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" It was a moment when heaven touched earth, when the invisible became visible, when doubt was consumed in the flames of divine glory. But Elijah's ministry was marked, not only by spectacular miracles, but by moments of profound humanity. After his victory over the prophets of Baal, he fled to the wilderness, exhausted and discouraged, ready to give up his prophetic calling. It was there, in a cave on Mount Horeb, that God taught him one of the most beautiful lessons in all of Scripture. God was not in the mighty wind that split the mountains, nor in the earthquake that shook the ground, nor in the fire that blazed across the sky. God was in the still, small voice, the gentle whisper that spoke to Elijah's heart when all the drama had passed. Elijah's successor, Elisha, served from 892 until 832 BCE, and his ministry was marked by a different kind of wonder. Where Elijah had been the prophet of fire and judgment, Elisha was the prophet of grace and healing. He multiplied oil for a widow, raised the dead son of a Shunammite woman, healed the Syrian general Naaman of his leprosy, and fed 100 men with 20 loaves of bread. His miracles were acts of compassion that pointed toward a God who cared, not only about the great affairs of nations, but about the daily struggles of ordinary people. From the southern kingdom came Isaiah, perhaps the greatest of all the prophets, whose ministry spanned the reigns of 4 kings of Judah. His prophecies began around 740 BC, during a time when the Assyrian Empire was casting its shadow across the ancient world. Isaiah's vision in the temple, when he saw the Lord high and lifted up, surrounded by seraphim crying, "Holy, holy," set the tone for a ministry that would combine devastating judgment with overwhelming hope. Isaiah's prophecies were like a two-edged sword, cutting through the complacency and self-deception of his time, while offering glimpses of a glory yet to come. He spoke words of comfort that have echoed through the ages. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned." A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." But Isaiah also saw visions that stretched far beyond his own time, prophecies of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, of a child who would be born, whose name would be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. In the darkest hours of Israel's history, Isaiah held up a lamp of hope that would not be extinguished. The northern kingdom also produced Hosea, whose own heartbreak became a living parable of God's relationship with Israel. Commanded by God to marry an unfaithful woman, Hosea experienced personally the pain of betrayal and abandonment. Yet through this agonizing experience, he came to understand the depth of God's love for his wayward people. "How can I give you up, Ephraim?" God cried through his prophet. "How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender." There was Amos, the shepherd from Tekoa, who left his flocks to thunder God's judgment against injustice and oppression. His words rang out like hammer blows. "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream." He saw, through the religious ceremonies and elaborate sacrifices to the heart of what God truly desired, not the performance of ritual, but the practice of righteousness. Micah, from the hill country of Judah, distilled the essence of prophetic religion into words that have never been surpassed for their clarity and power. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." The prophets were not mere fortune-tellers or political commentators. They were men and women who had stood in the counsel of the Almighty, who had heard the very heartbeat of God, and who came back to their people with messages that were often difficult to hear, but always necessary to proclaim. They spoke of judgment, yes, but judgment that was always tempered with the possibility of repentance and restoration. Their voices carried across the valleys and hills of the divided kingdom like the sound of distant thunder, warning of storms to come, but also promising that beyond the storm lay the clear sky of God's eternal faithfulness. They reminded Israel that she had been chosen not for privilege, but for purpose, not to be served, but to serve, not to hoard God's blessings, but to be a light to the nations. The prophets understood something that the kings and princes often forgot, that Israel's strength lay not in military might or political alliances, but in her covenant relationship with the God who had called her out of Egypt and made her his own. When she was faithful to that calling, she prospered. When she forgot it, she found herself facing the consequences of spiritual adultery. Their message was consistent across the centuries. "Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." They saw beyond the immediate political crises to the deeper spiritual realities that shaped the destiny of nations. They understood that worship and justice, faith and ethics, personal piety and social responsibility were all woven together in the fabric of covenant life. In the gentle darkness of night, as we listen to the wind whispering through the ancient hills where these prophets once walked, we can almost hear their voices still calling, pleading, warning, comforting. They spoke in different centuries, in different circumstances, to different kings and different crises, but their message was one. The God of Israel is faithful, and his people are called to be faithful in return. The prophets remind us that in every generation, in every age, there are voices crying in the wilderness, calling us back to what matters most. They may not perform dramatic miracles or speak with the authority of ancient seers, but they carry the same essential message, that there is a God who loves us, who calls us to justice and mercy, and who offers hope even in the darkest hours. As we rest tonight in the quiet assurance of God's enduring love, let us remember that the voices of the prophets still speak to us across the centuries. Their words of judgment have been fulfilled, but their words of hope remain as fresh and vital as the morning dew. They remind us that no matter how far we may wander, no matter how deep our failures or how complete our rebellion, the God of the prophets is still calling us home. In the stillness of this night, may we hear that still, small voice that spoke to Elijah in the cave, the voice that continues to whisper words of comfort to Jerusalem, words of hope to the discouraged, words of challenge to the complacent, and words of love to all who have ears to hear. The prophets have long since been gathered to their fathers, but their message endures. The Lord, He is God, and there is none beside Him. In that truth, we find our rest, our hope, and our peace as we surrender to the gentle embrace of sleep, knowing that the God of the prophets watches over us still. The evening breeze carries with it tonight a different quality, dear friends. As we settle into our comfortable chairs, as the day's worries begin to fade like shadows at twilight, we find ourselves approaching one of history's most profound moments of transformation. Tonight, we walk alongside a people facing their darkest hour, yet somehow discovering within that darkness the seeds of an unshakable hope. Picture, if you will, the Jerusalem of 586 before the Common Era. The city that David had claimed, that Solomon had adorned with golden splendor, now stands vulnerable beneath storm clouds that have been gathering for decades. The great Babylonian Empire, like a patient tide, has been advancing westward, swallowing kingdoms as it comes. And now, at last, that tide reaches the walls of the holy city. But let us not rush toward that moment of sorrow. Instead, let us understand how Jerusalem came to stand alone in this vast world, like a single candle flickering in an endless night. In the years following Solomon's death, as we learned in our previous gentle journey together, the kingdom had split like a great cedar struck by lightning. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its 10 tribes, had already fallen to the Assyrians more than a century before. Those 10 tribes had vanished into history, scattered like seeds on the wind, leaving only stories and memories in their wake. Now only Judah remained, the small southern kingdom centered around Jerusalem and its temple. King Zedekiah sat upon David's throne, but his was a reign shadowed by impossible choices. The great powers of that ancient world, Egypt to the south and Babylon to the north, pulled at tiny Judah like giants playing tug-of-war with a child's toy. Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon, had already come to Jerusalem twice before. Each time, he had taken tribute, taken hostages, taken treasures from the temple. Among those earlier captives had been a young man named Daniel, who would find favor in the Babylonian court and see visions of times yet to come. But still Jerusalem stood. The prophets had warned of this day. Jeremiah, walking the streets of Jerusalem with tears streaming down his weathered face, had pleaded with the people to turn back to their covenant with the Almighty. His voice, like wind through olive groves, had carried both judgment and mercy. Thus says the Lord, he would cry, choose life, that you and your children may live. But the words fell on ears grown deaf to divine whispers. The wealthy had forgotten the poor at their gates. The priests had turned the temple into a marketplace. The people trusted in their walls of stone rather than the God who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. They believed that because Jerusalem was the city of David, because it housed the temple of Solomon, surely it could never fall. How? Often we human beings make this same mistake, placing our trust in things we can see and touch, forgetting that true security comes from sources beyond our physical sight. And so the siege began, like a slow-moving dream that gradually becomes a nightmare. Nebuchadnezzar's armies surrounded Jerusalem completely, building walls of their own around the city's walls, ensuring that nothing could enter or leave. No food could come in. No messages could go out. The city became an island in an ocean of bronze spears and iron shields. Month after month, the siege continued. The wealthy families gradually consumed their stored grain. The markets emptied. Children began to cry. From hunger, their voices growing weaker as weeks turned to months. Mothers, those angels of mercy, shared their last crusts of bread with their little ones, going hungry themselves so their children might have one more day. Inside the temple, the priests continued their daily sacrifices as long as animals remained. But as the siege tightened its grip, even these sacred rituals began to fail. The great golden lampstand, which had burned continuously since Solomon's day, began to flicker as oil became scarce. King Zedekiah walked the walls at night, looking out over the campfires of the Babylonian army that stretched beyond the horizon like fallen stars. He had been placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar himself after the previous king, Jehoiachin, had been taken into exile, along with thousands of Jerusalem's finest citizens. Zedekiah knew he was caught between heaven and earth, between the demands of his Babylonian overlord and the desperate needs of his dying city. The prophet Jeremiah, despite being imprisoned for his unpopular messages, continued to counsel surrender. "The Lord has given this city into the hand of the king of Babylon," he said. "Those who go out to the Babylonians shall live." But his words sounded like treason to ears that had grown deaf to wisdom. As winter turned to spring and spring to summer, the situation became desperate beyond imagination. Families began to eat anything they could find. Leather was boiled into broth. Tree bark was ground into flour. The siege had transformed Jerusalem into a city of ghosts where the living envied the dead. Finally, in the summer heat that shimmered off the ancient stones, the walls were breached. Babylonian soldiers poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The sound of their war cries mixed with the screams of the population, creating a terrible symphony that echoed off the hills surrounding the holy city. King Zedekiah, seeing that all was lost, attempted to flee under cover of darkness. He and his remaining guards tried to escape through a gate near the king's garden, hoping to reach the Jordan Valley and perhaps find safety beyond the river. But the Babylonian forces, organized and methodical, captured him near Jericho, the same city that had fallen to Joshua's trumpet so many centuries before. The punishment for rebellion in the ancient world was swift and terrible. Zedekiah was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, forced to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes. Then his own eyes were put out, and he was bound in bronze chains to be taken to Babylon, where he would live the rest of his days in darkness, carrying forever the last image of his children's faces. But it was not only the king who suffered. The Babylonians, under the command of Nebuzaradan, a captain of the guard, set about the systematic destruction of everything that had made Jerusalem the jewel of Judah. The palace that had housed David and Solomon was burned. The houses of the wealthy were pulled down stone by stone. And then came the moment that would echo through history for millennia to come. The temple, Solomon's magnificent temple, the dwelling place of the Most High, was set ablaze. The golden cherubim melted in the flames. The bronze pillars, Yakin, and Boaz, which had stood at the temple entrance for 4 centuries, were broken up and carried away as scrap metal. The Ark of the Covenant, that most sacred object which had journeyed with Israel from Mount Sinai, simply vanished. Some said it had been hidden away by faithful priests before the city fell. Others believed it had been destroyed in the flames. But from that day forward, its location became one of history's greatest mysteries. The people watched in stunned silence as smoke rose from their holy mountain, carrying with it the ashes of their dreams, their hopes, their very identity as a people chosen by God. Many must have wondered if the Almighty had finally abandoned them completely. But even in this darkest hour, there were glimmers of hope, like stars that shine brightest against the deepest night. Nebuzaradan, surprisingly, showed mercy to Jeremiah, the prophet, offering him safe passage to Babylon or permission to remain in the ruined land. Jeremiah chose to stay with the poorest of the poor, those who had been left behind to tend the vineyards and fields. The cream of Jerusalem's population, the skilled craftsmen, the scholars, the priests, the nobles, were marched away in chains toward Babylon, a journey of nearly 1,000 miles through desert and wilderness. Among them walked young people who had never seen their city other than in its glory, children who would grow to adulthood in a foreign land, speaking a foreign tongue. Quietly at first, then with growing strength, they sang the songs of Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. One psalm would later. Record. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And yet, sing they did. In their sorrow, in their loss, in their displacement, they discovered something remarkable. They learned that their God was not limited to a temple made of stone and gold. The divine presence could not be destroyed by fire or carried away as plunder. Their faith, refined by suffering, would prove stronger than the bronze and iron of their captors. In Babylon, they would build synagogues, houses of study and prayer that required no sacrifices, no priests from the tribe of Levi, no golden vessels. They would develop new ways of worship, new forms of study, new expressions of their ancient faith. Some, like Daniel and his companions, would rise to positions of influence in the Babylonian court. Others would become merchants and scholars, keeping their traditions alive through teaching and example. The exile that seemed like an ending would prove to be a beginning. The God who had spoken to Abraham beside the oaks of Mamre, who had appeared to Moses in a burning bush, who had filled Solomon's temple with glory, was not confined to Jerusalem's walls. The divine presence traveled with the people, dwelt among them in their sorrow, and would eventually lead them home again. As we close this chapter of our gentle journey together, dear friends, let us remember that sometimes our greatest defeats become the doorways to our most profound victories. Jerusalem that fell in 586 BC was built of stone and wood, gold and silver. But the Jerusalem that lived on in the hearts of the exiles was built of something far more enduring: memory and hope, faith and love, the unbreakable bonds that tie human hearts to the divine. Tomorrow's sun would rise over the ruins of the holy city, casting long shadows across the broken stones. But it would also rise over the camps of the exiles, illuminating faces turned toward a future that held possibilities they could not yet imagine. For this was not the end of their story, but rather the turning of a page in the great book of their people's journey through time. Rest now, knowing that even in our darkest hours, we are not abandoned. Even when our own cities of hope seem to crumble around us, the foundations of love and faith remain unshakable. Good night, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the kind of hope that can survive any siege, any exile, any seeming defeat. The stars that shone over Babylon also shone over Jerusalem's ruins, and they shine over us tonight, reminding use that light endures, that hope persists, and that every ending contains within it the seed of a new beginning. The night air tonight carries with it the scent of possibility, dear friends. As we settle into this peaceful moment together, leaving behind the cares of our day, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most remarkable transformations. Tonight, we walk alongside a people who thought they had lost everything, only to discover that sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a magnificent new beginning. 50 years have passed since the flames consumed Solomon's temple. 50 years since the golden cherubim melted in the heat, since the bronze pillars were hauled away as scrap metal, since the children of Jerusalem were marched in chains toward Babylon. 50 years is a lifetime, long enough for babies born in exile to grow into middle age, long enough for the elderly who remember Jerusalem to pass into eternal rest. But memory, dear friends, memory is a curious thing. It has a way of keeping dreams alive, even when circumstances seem hopeless. In the markets of Babylon, Hebrew mothers still whispered to their children about a city built on hills, where their ancestors had walked with kings and prophets. Grandfathers, their beards now white as wool, would point toward the western horizon, and speak of stones that had heard the songs of David, of a temple where the divine presence had once dwelt among mortals. The empire that had seemed eternal was changing. Babylon, that great city with its hanging gardens and towering ziggurats, was itself facing a new power rising from the east. Cyrus of Persia, A king unlike any the world had known was building an empire not just through conquest, but through an revolutionary idea that different peoples, with their different gods and customs, could live together in harmony under one vast, tolerant realm. In the court of Babylon, Daniel had grown old in service to kings, his hair silver now, his face lined with the wisdom that comes from years of faithful service. He had interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, had survived the lion's den under Darius, and had received visions of kingdoms yet to come. Now, in his final years, he sensed that the time of restoration was drawing near. The prophet Jeremiah, before his death, had spoken of 70 years. 70 years of exile, and then return. The number had seemed impossibly long when Jerusalem's walls first crumbled, but now, as Persian armies marched toward Babylon's gates, some began to count the years. With trembling hope, when Cyrus entered Babylon, he came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. Where previous conquerors had imposed their own gods and customs, Cyrus published a decree that would echo through the centuries. Each people, he declared, should be free to return to their ancestral lands, to rebuild their temples, to worship their gods according to their ancient traditions. The cylinder of clay on which this decree was inscribed would one day be called the first charter of human rights. But for the descendants of those who had wept by Babylon's rivers, it meant something even more precious. It meant they could go home. Picture, if you will, that moment when the decree was first read in the Jewish quarter of Babylon. The scroll was unrolled by a scribe, his voice carrying across a crowd that had gathered in the early morning light. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem. Some wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. Children tugged at their parents' robes, asking what the words meant. Old men who had never expected to see this day fell to their knees in thanksgiving. After 50 years of exile, the impossible had become possible, but freedom to return did not mean everyone would choose to go. Babylon had become home to many. Children born in exile had established businesses, made friendships, built lives in the land of their captivity. The journey back to Jerusalem was long and dangerous, and what awaited them there was uncertain. The city lay in ruins. The land had been neglected. Starting over would require extraordinary courage. Yet when the call went out for volunteers to make the journey, tens of thousands responded. Led by a prince named Zerubbabel, a descendant of David's royal line, and by Joshua the high priest, they prepared for the journey that would take them back across the desert to their ancestral home. Persian king was generous beyond expectation. Not only did he permit the return, he ordered that the temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away as trophies should be restored to Jerusalem. Gold bowls that had caught the light in Solomon's temple, silver platters that had held the chi, sacred bread, bronze implements that had been used in the daily sacrifices. All were carefully counted and loaded onto wagons for the journey home. The procession that set out from Babylon must have been a sight to stir the heart. Nearly 50,000 souls, walking in family groups, their possessions loaded on donkeys and camels, their faces turned toward the west. They carried with them not just their earthly goods, but something far more precious, the accumulated wisdom of exile, the deeper understanding of their faith that had been forged in the fires of displacement. They had learned in Babylon that their God was not limited to one place, that worship could happen anywhere hearts were sincere, that study and prayer were as important as sacrifice. They had developed new forms of religious expression, new ways of teaching their children, new methods of preserving their ancient traditions. The exile had been meant to destroy them, but instead It had refined them like silver in a furnace. Journey took months across the same desert paths their ancestors had traveled. But this time, they were not fleeing in haste as Jacob had fled from Laban, or wandering in uncertainty as Moses had led them from Egypt. This time, they were going home by royal decree, with resources and protection, with hope and purpose. When they finally crested the hills overlooking Jerusalem, what they saw must have broken their hearts and lifted their spirits simultaneously. The city was indeed in ruins, just as the reports had said. Weeds grew through the cracks in David's palace. The Temple Mount was a heap of blackened stones. The walls that had once seemed so mighty lay tumbled like a child's blocks scattered by a careless hand. But underneath the ruins, they could see the ancient foundations, solid and true. The rock on which Abraham had been willing to sacrifice Isaac was still there. The spring of Gihon still bubbled with fresh water. The hills that David had walked still rose majestically toward heaven. Jerusalem was wounded, but Jerusalem endured. First task was simply to clear away the debris, to make space for the living among the remnants of the past. Stone by stone, they lifted away the rubble. Families claimed plots of land where their ancestors had lived. Farmers began to prepare fields that had lain fallow for decades. Slowly, gradually, life began to return to the holy city. But it was the rebuilding of the temple that captured everyone's imagination. This was not just construction, but resurrection. This was not just about creating a building, but about renewing a covenant, about declaring to the world that the God of Israel was still alive, still present, still faithful to ancient promises. When the foundation of the new temple was laid, the celebration was unlike anything Jerusalem had seen in generations. The priests put on their vestments, the Levites took up their instruments, and the whole assembly broke into songs of praise. For He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. They sang, their voices echoing off the surrounding hills. But even in that moment of joy, there was poignancy. Among the crowd were old men who had seen Solomon's temple in its glory before the exile. When they saw the new foundation, they wept, not from sorrow, but from the complex emotions that come when dreams long deferred finally begin to take shape. The young people shouted for joy, but the elderly wept, and the sound of rejoicing mixed with the sound of weeping until no one could distinguish one from the other. The new temple would not be as magnificent as Solomon's had been. There was no gold from Ophir, no cedars from Lebanon presented as gifts from foreign kings. But what it lacked in material splendor, it made up for in spiritual significance. This temple represented something even more precious than the first. It represented the triumph of hope over despair, of faith over circumstances, of divine faithfulness over human failure. The work was not easy. Opposition arose from neighboring peoples who had settled in the land during the exile. Resources were limited. Discouragement crept in during the long months of slow progress. At times, the work stopped altogether as the community struggled with the practical challenges of rebuilding. Not just buildings, but an entire society. It was then that prophets arose to encourage the people. Haggai asked why they were living in fine houses while God's house lay in ruins. Zechariah brought visions of a golden lampstand and olive trees, promising that the work would be completed, not by human might or power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. Their words rekindled the fire of dedication that had brought the people home. Gradually, the temple began to take shape. Walls rose from the ancient foundations. The altar was rebuilt and sacrifices resumed. The great festivals were celebrated once again. The sound of rams' horns echoed across Jerusalem on the Day of Atonement. Children born in the New Jerusalem grew up hearing the ancient songs, learning the old stories, carrying forward the traditions that had survived exile and return. When the temple was finally completed, About 20 years after the first returnees had arrived, the dedication was a moment of pure joy. King Darius of Persia had not only confirmed Cyrus's original decree, but had provided additional resources for the completion of the work. The God who had moved the heart of Cyrus had also moved the heart of his successor. The second temple was different from the first in many ways. It was smaller, less ornate, built with more modest materials. The Ark of the Covenant was missing, never to be recovered. The Holy of Holies stood empty, except for a stone where the Ark had once rested. Yet the divine presence filled this temple just as surely as it had filled Solomon's, for God's dwelling among mortals depends not on gold and precious stones, but on sincere hearts and faithful worship. The community that gathered around this new temple was different too. They had been shaped by exile, refined by suffering, deepened by reflection. They had learned to value study as much as sacrifice, to find God in everyday life as much as in sacred ritual. They had developed a portable faith that could survive any catastrophe, any displacement, any trial. As we close this chapter of our gentle journey together, dear friends, let us reflect on the profound truth it reveals. Sometimes what appears to be our greatest loss becomes the doorway to our most significant growth. The people who returned from Babylon were not the same people who had been taken into exile. They had been transformed by their experience, made stronger by their struggles, made wiser by their wandering. The temple they built may have been less magnificent than Solomon's, but it served a community that had learned lessons Solomon's generation could never have imagined. They had discovered that faith is not about buildings, but about hearts, not about location, but about dedication, not about circumstances, but about trust in a God whose love is steadfast and whose promises endure forever. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that every ending in your life has within it the potential for a new beginning. Every exile can become a journey home to something better than what was lost. Every temple that falls can be rebuilt with materials stronger than stone, with foundations deeper than bedrock. The unshakable certainty that love endures, hope persists, and faith creates possibilities that surpass our wildest dreams. Stars that guided the exiles home from Babylon shine over us tonight, reminding us that no matter how far we may wander, no matter how long the journey may be, the path home to what matters most is always open, always illuminated by the light of grace. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the joy of homecoming and the peace of renewal. And now, dear friends, as our gentle journey through the ancient kingdoms draws to its close, we find ourselves here in this quiet moment together, having walked alongside kings and shepherds, prophets and common folk, through valleys of shadow and up mountains of hope. Tonight, as the world around us settles into peaceful rest, we turn our gaze one final time toward that golden city set upon a hill, Jerusalem, whose story has no ending because it lives not just in history books, but in the human heart itself. Picture, with me, if you will, Jerusalem as night falls over its ancient stones. The sun, that same sun that warmed Abraham's face as he climbed Mount Moriah, that guided Moses through the wilderness, that witnessed David's dancing before the ark, slowly disappears behind the western hills. But as darkness gathers, something magical happens. Lights begin to appear, one by one, like earthbound stars scattered across the city's many neighborhoods. From our vantage point high above the city, we can see the glow emanating from countless windows. In homes both modest and grand, families are gathering around their tables. Children are being tucked into bed with the same lullabies their ancestors sang in Babylon, the same prayers their forefathers whispered in Solomon's courts. The city that has witnessed so much sorrow, so much joy, so much transformation, continues its eternal rhythm of daily life. Look there, toward the Temple Mount, where the golden dome catches the last rays of sunlight and seems to hold them, glowing like a captured piece of heaven. This is not Solomon's temple, nor even the second temple that Zerubbabel built. Those have long since passed into memory. But the rock beneath, the foundation stone of the world according to ancient tradition, remains as solid and enduring as sin. The day Abraham laid Isaac upon it in trust and obedience. The streets below us hum with the quiet activity of evening. In the Jewish quarter, Sabbath candles flicker in windows, their gentle light speaking of traditions that have survived every storm. In the Christian quarter, bells toll softly, calling the faithful to evening prayers, their bronze voices echoing the same hope that once filled the hearts of the disciples. In the Muslim quarter, the call to prayer rises like incense toward the stars, a reminder that this city is sacred to children of Abraham by many paths. How extraordinary it is that this single city, built on these particular hills beside this specific spring, should have become the spiritual center of half the world's population. Pilgrims come here from every continent, speaking every language, carrying prayers formed in every human heart. They come seeking what countless generations before them have sought, a glimpse of the eternal, a touch of the divine, a moment when heaven and earth seem to meet. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Jerusalem is not its grand monuments or its famous walls, but something far more subtle and profound. It is the way this city has learned to hold both sorrow and joy, both memory and hope, both the weight of the past and the possibility of the future, all within its ancient embrace. We have seen, through our gentle journey together, how this city has been conquered and liberated, destroyed and rebuilt, abandoned and reclaimed. We have watched its people exiled and restored, scattered and regathered, broken and made whole again. Yet through it all, something essential has endured, something that no army can destroy, no fire can consume, no exile can erase. That something is the power of sacred story to shape human hearts. The tales we have shared together of Abraham's journey from yore, of Moses leading slaves to freedom, of David the shepherd boy becoming king, of Solomon's wisdom and temple, of prophets who spoke truth to power, of exile and return. These are not merely historical accounts. They are the foundation stories of how ordinary human beings can live extraordinary lives of faith, hope, and love. In every generation, people have found in these ancient narratives the courage to face their own giants, to cross their own wilderness, to build their own temples of meaning and purpose. The Jerusalem that truly matters is not made of limestone blocks and mortar, but of the dreams and prayers, the struggles and triumphs, of countless souls who have found in this city story a reflection of their own deepest longings. As we sit here together in the peaceful darkness, listening to our own breath, feeling our own heartbeat, we are connected to that vast community of seekers who have looked toward Jerusalem across the centuries. The businessman in ancient Rome who converted to Judaism after hearing the Torah read in a synagogue. The medieval pilgrim who walked hundreds of miles to pray at the Holy Sepulchre. The immigrant family in modern New York who lights Sabbath candles each Friday, remembering. The grandmother in rural Alabama who teaches her grandchildren to sing, "Jerusalem, my happy home." All of them, all of us, are part of Jerusalem's continuing story. For this city has never been merely a place on a map. It has always been an idea, a symbol, a state of the heart. It represents humanity's eternal search for home, for meaning, for connection to something greater than ourselves. The Hebrew word shalom, which we often translate simply as peace, comes from the same root as Shalem, the ancient name of Jerusalem. But shalom means more than the absence of conflict. It speaks of wholeness, completeness, the deep harmony that comes when all things are in their proper place, when all relationships are rightly ordered, when earth and heaven dance together. In perfect rhythm. This is the Jerusalem that lives beyond history, beyond geography, beyond the reach of any earthly power. This is the Jerusalem that the prophet Isaiah saw in his vision, where nations would beat their swords into plowshares, where the wolf would lie down with the lamb, where every tear would be wiped away and death would be no more. That Jerusalem is not yet fully realized in our world. We still live in times when swords are needed, when wolves prowl, when tears fall like rain. But the vision persists, carried forward by every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every choice to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to hope rather than despair. The lights that twinkle now in Jerusalem's windows are part of that eternal hope. Each family gathering around their table, each child being sung to sleep, each prayer whispered into the darkness, adds another small flame to the great light that this city represents. Not the light of conquest or dominion, but the gentle light of human dignity, of divine love, of promises kept across the generations. From our quiet vantage point, we can see beyond the city to the surrounding hills, dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Those hills have watched over Jerusalem for millennia, standing as silent witnesses to all the drama that has unfolded in the valley below. They were there when Abraham climbed toward his moment of testing. They heard David's harp echoing across the Kidron Valley. They felt the earth shake when the temple fell, and they rejoiced when it rose again. Tonight, those same hills keep their ancient vigil, and we join them in their patient watching. For Jerusalem's story is not finished. It continues to unfold, in ways both seen and unseen, in the daily choices of ordinary people who still dare to believe that love is stronger than hate, that hope can survive any defeat, that faith can move mountains and heal hearts, and make all things new. As our journey together draws to its close. Dear friends, let us carry within us the peace of Jerusalem, not as a distant ideal, but as a present reality. Let us be builders of bridges where others see only walls. Let us be lighters of candles where others curse the darkness. Let us be planters of seeds where others see only barren ground. The city that never sleeps watches over us all tonight, not with eyes of stone and mortar, but with the loving gaze of every generation that has found in its story a reason to hope, a call to serve, an invitation to become more than they ever dreamed possible. Rest now in that ancient peace, that Jerusalem shalom that passes all understanding. Let your dreams be filled with golden light reflecting off ancient stones, with the sound of children's laughter echoing through narrow streets, with the whisper of prayers ascending like incense toward the stars. And remember, always remember, that wherever you are, whatever challenges you face, whatever dreams you carry in your heart, you are part of this continuing story. You are a living stone in the Jerusalem that is always being built, the city whose architect and builder is love itself, whose walls are salvation, and whose gates are praise. Sleep well, dear friends, beneath the same stars that have watched over Jerusalem since the beginning of time. Tomorrow will bring new chapters to write, new stones to lay, new lights to kindle in the eternal city that lives wherever human hearts dare to hope, to love, and to believe that the best of all possible worlds is not just a dream, but a promise, waiting to be fulfilled. Good night, and may the peace of Jerusalem be with you always, until all our journeys lead us home to the city that never sleeps, the city that is always becoming, the city that lives forever in the geography of the human soul.